What happens when one of comedy's sharpest tongues walks into a room built for controlled conversation and refuses to play by the rules? Before we go any further, if you love explosive celebrity moments, behind-the-scenes tension, and cinematic storytelling you won't hear anywhere else, subscribe to Stage View right now. Hit that like button and drop a comment letting us know what kind of stories you want next. You don't want to miss what's coming. The studio lights were already blazing when Chris Rock stepped onto the polished floor of The View. They were the kind of lights that didn't just illuminate your face, they exposed you. Every pore, every twitch, every unguarded thought you'd buried before walking on set. Chris adjusted his jacket, flashed a half-smile to the applause rolling toward him, and nodded like a man who had done this 1,000 times before. Late-night sets, award shows, roasts, arenas full of people laughing on cue. This was familiar territory, and yet something felt off. Maybe it was the way the applause lingered a second too long, like the audience wasn't sure whether they were welcoming a guest or bracing for impact. Maybe it was the quiet glances exchanged at the host table. Whoopi Goldberg calm but watchful, Joy Behar already smirking, Sarah Haynes sitting upright like a student waiting for a pop quiz. And then there was Sunny Hostin. Sunny sat perfectly still, hands folded, eyes sharp. No smile. No performative warmth. Just focus. The kind of focus that says, I didn't come here to laugh today. Chris noticed it immediately. Comics always do. They read rooms for survival. He slid into his chair, leaned back slightly, and crossed one leg over the other. Defensive posture masked as casual confidence. Whoopi opened the show with ease. Chris Rock is here, she said, her voice smooth, practiced. New projects, new tours, always something to say. Chris grinned. That's the problem right there. Y'all keep letting me talk. Laughter broke out. The audience relaxed. For a moment, the tension dissolved like steam escaping a pressure valve. For a moment, Joy leaned forward. Chris, you've always said comedy is about truth. Do you feel like people are more sensitive now than ever? Chris didn't hesitate. Sensitive? No. People are selective. They like jokes, as long as they're not the punchline. More laughter. Applause. Heads nodding. Sunny tilted her head slightly. Chris kept going, warming up. Everybody says they want honesty, but what they really want is agreement. This time the applause was uneven. Some clapped hard. Others shifted in their seats. Sunny leaned toward her microphone. And who decides what honesty looks like? She asked. The tone changed instantly. No joke in her voice. No smile to soften the edges. Chris turned his head slowly toward her. His grin tightened. Not gone, but no longer relaxed. Well, he said carefully, I think honesty is when you say what you actually believe. Sunny nodded once. Even when that belief harms people. The audience went quiet. Chris blinked. Comedy isn't harm. It's commentary. Sunny didn't look convinced. It can be both. Whoopi raised a hand slightly. But Sunny was already in motion. You've said before, Sunny continued, her voice steady but loaded, that comedians are being silenced by wokeness. That people can't take jokes anymore. But what about the people who feel those jokes reinforce stereotypes that affect their real lives? Chris leaned forward now, elbows on his knees. The casual posture was gone. So now jokes are responsible for society, he asked. That's a lot of power you're giving punchlines. Sunny met his gaze. Words have power. You know that. That's why people listen to you. The audience murmured. Low, restless. Chris exhaled through his nose. People listen to me because I'm funny. A few laughs. Nervous ones. Sunny didn't back down. They listen because you're influential. Chris tilted his head. So what, comedians are supposed to run jokes by a focus group now? Joy chuckled. That'd be a short show. Chris laughed too, but his eyes never left Sunny. She didn't smile. What I'm asking, Sunny said, is whether you ever consider that the line between truth and cruelty isn't as clear as comedians pretend it is. That landed hard. Chris sat back, crossed his arms. That's the thing. It's not my job to protect feelings. It's my job to tell the truth as I see it. Sunny raised an eyebrow. Your truth? Yes, Chris snapped slightly. My truth. I don't speak for everyone. Yet you speak to millions, Sunny replied. The air felt heavier now. Even the audience seemed unsure whether they were watching a daytime talk show or a courtroom cross-examination. Whoopi leaned in again. All right, let's take a breath. Chris interrupted, his voice sharper than before. No, let's talk about it. Because every time someone doesn't like a joke, suddenly it's a moral crisis. Sunny leaned forward too, matching his intensity. And every time someone criticizes a joke, comedians act like they're being persecuted. The audience gasped softly. Someone in the front row whispered, "Oh." Chris smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile that came right before a punchline or a punch. "Persecuted," he repeated. "I'm sitting here on national television. Nobody's canceling me." "Yet," Sunny said quietly. That word hung in the air like smoke. Chris laughed, loud and sudden. "See, that right there. Fear. That's what this conversation runs on." Sunny's eyes narrowed. "No. Accountability." The applause that followed was split clean down the middle. Chris shook his head. "You know what accountability is? Bombing. When a joke doesn't land, the audience lets you know. That's the system. And when a joke lands but hurts people who aren't in the room?" Sunny asked. Chris leaned back again, jaw tightening. "Then that's life. You don't get to live without being offended." Sunny's voice softened, but only slightly. "That's easy to say when you're not the one being laughed at." Silence. Chris looked at her for a long moment. The comic mask flickered. "You think I've never been laughed at?" he said quietly. "I built a career out of it." Sunny didn't blink. "You built a career out of controlling the narrative." That one hit differently. The audience shifted. Someone clapped once, then stopped. Chris leaned forward again, voice lower now. "So what do you want, Sunny? An apology tour? A disclaimer before every joke?" "I want awareness," she said. "I want honesty about impact, not just intent." Chris scoffed. "Impact is subjective." "So is humor," Sunny shot back. Whoopi finally stepped in, her voice firm. Okay. We're not going to tear each other apart here." Chris laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. "I'm fine. I love this. This is America. Disagreeing on TV." Sunny nodded slowly. "Then let's really disagree." Chris turned fully toward her. "All right." The room felt like it was leaning forward with them. Sunny spoke carefully now, choosing each word. "Do you believe there are topics that should be off limits?" Chris didn't answer right away. "No," he said finally. "Because once you draw that line, it keeps moving. And it never moves in favor of truth." Sunny held his gaze. "Or compassion." Chris's voice hardened. "Compassion doesn't make people laugh." Sunny replied, calm but cutting. "Maybe that's the problem." The audience erupted, some cheering, some booing, some clapping so hard it echoed off the walls. Chris sat back, lips pressed together. The smile was gone now. For the first time since he walked out, he looked less like the man in control, and more like someone realizing this wasn't just another interview. This wasn't banter. This was a battle of worldviews unfolding live with nowhere to hide. And it was only just beginning. The applause faded unevenly, like rain hitting different surfaces at different times. Chris Rock glanced out at the audience, then back at the table. The smiles were gone now. Whatever this had started as, it had crossed into something heavier, something personal. Whoopi cleared her throat. "All right," she said, measured, authoritative. "We're going to take a quick breath here." But the air refused to reset. Sunny sat back in her chair, but her posture stayed alert, coiled. Chris could feel it. She wasn't finished. Not even close. And some part of him, the part that had survived decades of hecklers and hostile rooms, knew backing down now would feel like surrender. "So let me ask you this," Chris said, breaking the pause before anyone else could. His voice was calmer, but there was steel under it. "When does intent stop mattering?" Sunny turned to him slowly. "Intent always matters," she said. "It just doesn't erase consequences." Chris shook his head. "That's a slippery slope. Because once consequences are defined by whoever's loudest, art dies." Joy leaned in. "I don't know, Chris. Art survived worse than talk shows." A ripple of laughter passed through the audience, but it didn't relieve the tension. It only sharpened it. Sunny folded her hands again. "You say art dies. But whose art are we protecting? Historically, it's always been the people with the microphone." Chris's eyebrows lifted. "You think I was handed a microphone?" "I think you earned it," Sunny replied quickly. "And with that comes responsibility." There it was again. That word. Chris leaned back, eyes briefly closing, as if restraining himself. "Responsibility is for politicians," he said. "I tell jokes." Sunny tilted her head. "You tell jokes about race, gender, trauma, violence. Those aren't neutral topics." Chris opened his eyes. "Neither is reality." The audience murmured. Someone in the back clapped. Someone else shook their head. Whoopi watched them both closely, sensing the line thinning beneath their feet. Sunny inhaled. Let's be specific then. Chris's jaw tightened. Okay, you've joked publicly about marginalized groups, she said. And when people criticize those jokes, your response is that they're too sensitive. Do you ever consider that maybe they're not sensitive? Maybe they're tired? Chris's fingers tapped against the arm of his chair. Once. Twice. Attell. Tired of what? He asked. Tired of being reduced to material, Sonny answered. Tired of being told that if they don't laugh, they're the problem. Chris laughed softly, almost incredulous. You think comedians reduce people? I think bad jokes do, she said. That stung. Chris leaned forward. So now we're grading jokes morally? Sonny didn't flinch. We always have. Society just pretended otherwise. The audience reacted louder this time, applause swelling, then clashing with boos. It felt like the room itself had split into factions. Chris turned slightly toward the crowd, gesturing. See, this right here. That noise. That disagreement. That's the point. Sonny followed his gaze. Disagreement doesn't mean harm disappears. Chris snapped back. And avoiding harm doesn't mean truth magically shows up. Joy whistled under her breath. This got deep real fast. Chris smirked, but it faded quickly. Look, he said, turning back to Sonny. You're asking comedians to be therapists. To pre-diagnose every possible reaction. I'm asking for empathy, Sonny replied. Not censorship. Chris scoffed. Empathy is subjective. So is freedom, Sonny said. That landed like a dropped glass. Chris paused. For a split second, the room could see him thinking, not performing, not deflecting. Just calculating. Let me ask you something, he said quietly. Do you laugh at jokes you disagree with? Sonny considered it. Sometimes. Why? Because they're clever, she said. Or because they punch up. Chris nodded slowly. Exactly. So the issue isn't jokes. It's taste. Sonny shook her head. It's power. The word echoed. Chris leaned back, crossing his arms again. Power? You think comedians are powerful. You shape narratives, Sonny said. You normalize ideas. You make certain things easier to laugh at and harder to question. Chris's voice sharpened. I question everything. But do you question yourself? Sonny asked. The audience went still. Even the murmurs died. Chris stared at her. The silence stretched longer than felt comfortable for daytime television. I question myself every night on stage, he said finally. That's what bombing is. That's feedback. Sonny responded softly. Feedback from people who already chose to be there. Chris's eyes flicked toward her. You think my audience is a monolith? No, she said. I think the people who walk out rarely get heard. Chris let out a breathy laugh. That's life. Not everyone stays for the whole show. Sonny leaned forward again, voice firmer now. And not everyone has the luxury of leaving. That sentence cut deeper than any joke. Chris opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, he didn't immediately have a comeback. Whoopi seized the moment. Okay, she said gently. Let's ground this for a second. But the damage, or the breakthrough, was already done. Chris rubbed his chin, eyes narrowed. You're framing this like comedians are villains. I'm framing this like comedians are human, Sonny replied. Humans who can get it wrong. Chris nodded slowly. Sure, but humans who shouldn't be crucified for it. Sonny's voice hardened. Criticism isn't crucifixion. Chris leaned forward again, intensity returning. Tell that to people who lose gigs. To people who get labeled. Sonny shot back. Tell that to people who've been labeled their whole lives. The audience reacted loudly now, applause rolling, overlapping, clashing. Joy raised her hands. Okay. But Chris and Sonny were locked in now, the rest of the table fading into background noise. You want me to apologize for jokes? Chris asked. I want you to listen to why people are hurt, Sonny said. Chris exhaled sharply. I've been hurt. A lot. That didn't make the world stop for me. Sonny met his gaze. Pain isn't a competition. Chris's voice dropped. No, but resilience matters. So does compassion, Sonny replied. They stared at each other, neither blinking. The audience felt it, the collision of two philosophies, neither willing to bend. Whoopi finally stepped in with authority. We're going to take a break, she said, because clearly this conversation isn't done, but we need a pause. The applause that followed was uneasy, conflicted. As the cameras pulled back, Chris leaned toward Sonny, his voice low but audible to nearby microphones. You really think comedians are the problem? Sonny answered just as quietly. I think refusing to listen is. Chris sat back, eyes distant. The break music started to play, bright and cheerful, completely out of sync with the moment that had just unfolded. And behind the smiles that returned for the cameras, everyone in that studio knew one thing for certain. When the show came back, this wasn't going to cool down. It was going to explode. The music faded, the red light blinked back on, and just like that, they were live again. The smiles returned first. Not real ones, broadcast smiles. The kind that live on muscle memory, not emotion. Chris Rock straightened in his chair, rolling his shoulders like a fighter returning to the ring. Sunny Hostin adjusted her notes, though everyone could tell she didn't need them. Whatever was coming next wasn't written down. The audience settled, but not completely. There was a nervous energy now, a quiet buzz, like everyone knew they were about to witness something that would be replayed, clipped, argued over. Whoopi spoke first, her voice calm but deliberate. "All right, we're back." And clearly this conversation struck a nerve. Chris chuckled lightly. "That's usually my job." A few laughs broke out. Relief laughter. Temporary. Sunny glanced at him. "Only when people are willing to sit with discomfort." Chris turned toward her. "Discomfort is fine. But there's a difference between discomfort and punishment." Sunny raised an eyebrow. "Who's being punished right now?" Chris opened his hands, gesturing broadly. "Artists. Comedians. Anyone who says the wrong thing at the wrong time." Sunny leaned forward slightly. "Or anyone who refuses to evolve." The word hung there, evolve. Chris smiled thinly. "Evolve into what?" "Someone who understands that impact matters as much as intent," Sunny replied. Chris shook his head. "That sounds nice. But it's vague. And vague rules are dangerous." Joy leaned in again, sensing the moment. "You know, Chris, when I started comedy, half the stuff I said would get me fired today." Chris snapped his fingers. "Exactly." Sunny turned to Joy. "Or maybe it just wouldn't get laughs anymore." The audience reacted sharply, laughter mixed with gasps. Joy blinked, then laughed. "Touché." Chris leaned back, but his eyes stayed fixed on Sunny. "You keep saying impact," he said. "But impact changes depending on who's watching." "Yes," Sunny said. "That's the point." Chris frowned. "So what's the standard?" Sunny didn't hesitate. "Human dignity." Chris let out a breath that was half laugh, half sigh. "That's not a standard. That's a slogan." Sunny's voice sharpened. "It's a baseline." The room tightened again. Chris leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Let me tell you something," he said, quieter now. "Comedy comes from pain. From trauma. From saying the things people are scared to say." Sunny nodded slowly. "And sometimes those things hurt people who didn't cause that pain." Chris replied instantly. "Life hurts people who didn't cause it." Sunny met his eyes. "And we try to reduce that harm where we can." Chris paused. He glanced briefly toward Whoopi, then back to Sunny. "So where does that end?" "It doesn't," Sunny said. "That's the work." The audience murmured, some impressed, some irritated. Chris's voice rose slightly. "You're asking for perfection." "No," Sunny said. "I'm asking for reflection." Chris laughed, sharper this time. "Reflection happens on stage. In front of people. Not in think pieces." Sunny's lips pressed together. "Then why do comedians get so angry when people respond?" Chris shot back. "Because responding isn't the same as trying to end someone's career." Sunny leaned forward now, intensity matching his. "Criticism isn't cancellation." Chris's voice hardened. "Tell that to the people who disappeared." Sunny replied, "Tell that to the people who were never allowed a platform in the first place." The audience erupted again. Applause thundered, then collided with boos. Whoopi raised her hands. All right. But Chris spoke over her, emotions slipping through the cracks. "I grew up broke. I grew up angry. Comedy was my way out." Sunny's expression softened, but only for a moment. "And for some people, comedy is the place where they're reminded they don't belong." Chris looked at her, really looked at her now. "You think I want that?" "I think intention doesn't erase experience," Sunny said gently. Chris sat back slowly. The fight drained just enough for something else to surface. Frustration, maybe fatigue. "So what do you want from me?" he asked. Not sarcastic. Not biting. Just direct. Sunny took a breath. "I want you to admit that sometimes comedians get defensive instead of listening." Chris stared ahead, jaw tight. The audience leaned in. After a long pause, he said, "Maybe." The word rippled through the room. Sunny nodded once. "That's all." Chris exhaled, then shook his head. "But listening doesn't mean agreeing." "Of course not," Sunny replied. "It means respecting the conversation." Chris smirked faintly. You don't think I respect conversation? Sonny met his eyes. I think you respect winning. The audience gasped audibly. Chris laughed, but there was no humor in it. This isn't a competition. Sonny replied softly, then stopped treating it like one. Silence. Even the audience seemed unsure whether to react. Whoopi seized the moment. Okay, she said, voice steady but firm. I think what we're seeing here is two people who actually care deeply, but speak different languages. Chris nodded slowly. That's fair. Sonny nodded too. I'll agree with that. For a brief second, it looked like the storm might pass. Then Chris added, but I still think comedy shouldn't be policed. Sonny responded instantly. And I still think unchecked influence is dangerous. There it was again. Chris leaned back, rubbing his hands together. You know what? Let's be honest. Some people don't want jokes. They want silence. Sonny shook her head. No, they want respect. Chris snapped. Respect doesn't laugh. Sonny fired back. Neither does fear. The audience exploded, this time louder than before. People stood. People clapped. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Whoopi leaned in hard now. All right, we're not going to resolve this today. Chris laughed breathlessly. No kidding. Sonny smiled slightly, but there was steel behind it. But people watching will. Chris glanced toward the camera, then back to Sonny. Yeah, he said. They always do. The final seconds ticked down. The producer's voice echoed faintly from offstage. Wrap it up. Whoopi turned to the camera. Chris rock, everyone. The applause was massive, but fractured. Chris stood, buttoned his jacket, and leaned toward Sonny one last time. You don't hate comedy, he said quietly. Sonny looked up at him. And you don't hate accountability. They held each other's gaze for a beat longer than television etiquette allowed. Then Chris nodded once and walked off stage. The cameras cut, but the moment didn't end there. Because what happened next, outside the studio, online, and across the media, would turn this tense exchange into a full-blown cultural flashpoint. And the fallout was only just beginning. The moment the cameras shut off, the room exhaled, but the tension didn't leave. It just changed form. Chris Rock disappeared behind the curtain, the applause still echoing faintly in his ears, fractured and unresolved. Crew members avoided eye contact, pretending to check cables, screens, headsets, anything except the aftermath of what they'd just witnessed. This wasn't a clean segment. This wasn't a feel-good debate. This was a spark dropped into dry grass. Sonny Hostin remained seated for a beat longer than necessary, hands folded again, shoulders squared. Her face was composed, but her eyes betrayed something else, adrenaline maybe. Or the quiet awareness that whatever she'd just said would follow her long after the studio lights cooled. Whoopi stood and exhaled deeply. Phew, she muttered, half to herself. That one's going to travel. She was right. Within minutes, clips were being cut. Not the full conversation. Never the full conversation. Just the sharpest lines. The looks. The pauses. The moments where voices rose and smiles vanished. Compassion doesn't make people laugh. Maybe that's the problem. Do you question yourself? Criticism isn't cancellation. Each line ripped from context, compressed into 10 seconds of confrontation. By the time Chris reached his car, his phone was already vibrating nonstop. Messages from fellow comedians. Some supportive. Some warning him. Some laughing it off like it was just another day at the office. One text stood out. You didn't lose. But you didn't win either. Chris stared at the screen, jaw clenched. He slid the phone face down onto the seat beside him and leaned back, staring out the window as the car pulled away. The city blurred past, but his mind replayed the exchange frame by frame. Not the jokes, not the applause, but the silences. The moments where he'd hesitated. The word he'd said without planning to. Maybe. Sonny, meanwhile, walked down the hallway flanked by producers asking if she was okay, if she needed anything, if she wanted to clarify her points for social. She waved them off politely. I said what I said, she replied. But even she couldn't ignore her phone. Notifications stacked faster than she could read them. Some hailed her as brave. A truth teller. Someone who finally said out loud what others danced around. Others were furious. Ruined comedy. Went after the wrong one. Why can't you people just laugh? She paused at one comment longer than the rest. It wasn't angry. It wasn't supportive either. This conversation made me uncomfortable. I don't know who's right, but I'm glad it happened. Sonny locked her phone and slipped it into her bag. That night, the internet did what it always does when given a moment too complex for a headline. It chose sides. Clips of Chris circulated with captions like "Comedian destroys cancel culture narrative" and "Chris Rock exposes hypocrisy on live TV." Right beside them, equally viral clips framed Sonny as the victor. Sonny Hostin shuts down comedy excuses. Finally, someone held him accountable. Hashtags trended. Reaction videos flooded timelines. Comedians weighed in, some defensively, some cautiously, some with jokes sharp enough to cut themselves. One comic tweeted, "If comedy has to explain itself, it's already dead." Another replied, "If comedy can't listen, maybe it deserves the critique." Morning shows replayed the segment. News panels debated tone instead of substance. Podcasts dissected body language like it was a championship fight. Watch his eyes here. This is where he loses control. No, this is where she overreaches. Notice how the audience splits. This is America right now. By the next day, the narrative hardened. Chris Rock versus Sonny Hostin. As if it had ever been that simple. Chris broke his silence first, not with a statement, but on stage. That night, under dim lights, in front of an audience that came expecting laughs and left with something heavier, he addressed it. "Apparently," he said, pacing slowly, "I went to a talk show and accidentally joined a philosophy class." Laughter. Relieved. Familiar. "But here's the thing," he continued, voice shifting. "Everybody wants honesty, until honesty doesn't sound like them." The crowd applauded, loud and loyal. Yet somewhere between punchlines, he paused. "I don't think listening makes you weak," he added. "I just don't think it makes you funny." The audience cheered, but not as loudly this time. Sonny, days later, spoke on a different platform. Calm. Controlled. Measured. "This was never about canceling anyone," she said. "It was about acknowledging impact. Discomfort doesn't mean the conversation failed. Sometimes it means it finally started." Some praised her restraint. Others accused her of doubling down. The comments kept coming, faster than anyone could respond. What lingered wasn't a winner or a loser. It was the unresolved question hanging between them, and now, between millions of viewers. Should comedy be protected at all costs? Or should influence come with responsibility? In classrooms, people debated it. In green rooms, comedians argued about it. In comment sections, strangers yelled past each other, convinced the other side was the problem. And somewhere in the middle sat that moment on live television. Two people, two worldviews, neither willing to fully bend. No screaming match. No walk-off. No apology. Just friction. The kind that doesn't go away when the cameras stop rolling. The kind that reflects something bigger than a single interview. And now it's your turn. Did Chris Rock cross a line? Or did Sonny Hostin ask a question comedy doesn't want to answer? Whose side were you on? Or do you think the truth lives somewhere in between? Drop your opinion in the comments. Let's talk about it. And if you want more explosive, cinematic, behind-the-scenes stories like this, stories that don't fade when the clip ends, subscribe to Stage View right now. Because some moments aren't meant to be forgotten. They're meant to be felt.